This is part 3 of Jesus Never Mentioned Homosexuality, the book of Romans. The purpose is to reject claims that the Bible teaches consensual same-sex relationships as sin. And here's a recap of part 1. Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of their lack of charity, not homosexuality. Part 2, Leviticus, the difference between man and mankind. Please feel free to take a look at these two uploads, part 1 and part 2, for information about, or detailed information about those two books of the Bible. This is part 3, Romans chapter 1, nature, natural, and what is against nature. The first thing I want to address is the Bible was translated from ancient language into English, the English Bibles that we know today. I would advise anyone who's studying the Bible to use a Hebrew-Greek concordance, a dictionary, and a website. I'm going to refer BibleGateway.com for access to Bibles in other languages. I found it to be very helpful. Moving on in the first chapter of Romans, there are so many offenses listed that it's difficult for me to understand why people focus on the portion of the text regarding natural affections. I mean, in Romans chapter 1, so many things deserve attention. For example, being disobedient to parents, 31st verse, which mentions murder. And I just don't understand why people zone in on that natural part when there are a lot of other offenses to review or discuss. When the Greek Hebrew concordance, the word natural is associated to the word nature. But there are two definitions that I found for the word natural. One is much deeper than same-sex relationships. And it's deeper than sex. So I'm going to focus on the second definition for nature. And the second definition, according to Greek Hebrew concordance, is associated with the word natural. And in order to discuss what is against nature or unnatural, you have to define what is natural. So here we go. The Greek Hebrew concordance, my favorite, defines the word natural as disposition and constitution. In the Standard Dictionary, disposition is defined as the way something is arranged, meaning order. Constitution is defined as the basic principles and laws that determine the powers, duties of a government and guarantees certain rights to the people. So while watching an old movie channel, I happened upon this movie from 1969, and the title is Fellini Satiricon, or Fellini Satiricon. And there are elements in this movie that gave me a visual of the culture of the Romans. And I have to admit, what I saw was shocking. Even though it wasn't X-rated, the movie gave me some insight as to what Paul and the leaders of this particular sect of Judaism were having to deal with in the city of Rome. And based on what I saw in that movie, I would say that one of the things they may have had to deal with were the people who were practicing orgies. Orgies would be considered against nature, meaning abnormal, meaning out of the natural order for the native people of the Bible. An orgy would be opposite of what was defined as disposition or constitution, meaning what was natural or normal. And it's very possible that Paul would consider women with women and men with men doing whatever they wanted to do as vile. I really took my time to try to understand this, because it's been such a long time of hearing these messages about the book of Romans over and over again, and it just didn't make sense to me. So I would say that based on what I saw in that movie, that the orgy is the only thing that fits the description of what Paul was referring to in the book of Romans chapter 1. There is no order in an orgy, and there is no consent in an orgy. Was it natural for more than one person to be in a room having sex with whomever they choose? No, it was not. And it's very possible that Paul, Peter, and James would consider women with women and men with men abandoning control of themselves in a room, giving into lust and desire. I think they would consider that as being vile. And an orgy would be considered vile affections. I really believe that they would look at something like that, so as being vile. So I wanted to try to connect this book of Romans to something from the Old Testament, something that resembled disposition and constitution, something that could explain it. And so I found Abraham, right? Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. I found their story to fall in line with disposition and constitution. In Genesis 16 chapter 2nd verse, Abraham received permission from his wife, and Sarah was the chief wife. And in order to engage in sexual relationships with the second wife, you would need permission from the chief wife. He had to get permission from his chief wife, Sarah, in order to have sex with Hagar, the servant. Having sex with her without permission of the chief wife would be abnormal against what is natural. Another example of natural and nature is Genesis 30:15, when Jacob's wives were talking amongst each other, trying to decide who he was going to be with that night, bargaining his body, amongst themselves. And I mean, for me, it's odd in this day and time, but it does seem kind of right that this kind of order would be necessary in that kind of relationship to keep a bunch of confusion down. And there was a process. There was a natural order in being married to more than one person. And again, we fall into these two words, constitution and disposition. Something else to consider is rape. During the rule of the Pharaoh in biblical Afro-Egypt, what I call African Egypt, the law was based on order and harmony. And the reason I bring up Afro-Egypt is because Afro-Egypt was the dominant culture of the native people in biblical times. They believed in order, and non-consensual sex would be against nature. It will be against the natural order. And two examples of the consequences of non-consensual sex or rape are Genesis 34 chapter, when Joseph was accused of raping his boss's wife. They threw him in jail because he was accused of having non-consensual sex. In Genesis 39th chapter, Jacob's daughter was raped, something that was considered unnatural. Now, what was natural would be to ask someone to marry, can you marry me? Can we get married? But this young man decided to take her body. And the reason you know that the rape was wrong and it was against nature is because the family then tried to get her family's permission to allow them to get married. But her brothers was having no part to that, and so they killed their sister's rapist. The book of Romans addresses non-consensual sexual relationships. And in this movie, again, Fellini, Satyricon, some of the scenes are explicit. It's not X-rated, but the visuals of some of the things that were going on in Rome blew my mind, and I wouldn't consider it a great movie, but I saw enough in that movie for me to stop and say, woohoo, wow, ooh, okay, well, this is what was going on. And after I saw the movie, I just felt like even more that it was important. It's very important for people to understand words. When reading the Bible, it has to be looked at as in a form of study. You have to look at every word, study as many words as you can to get the original interpretation of those words. And those words, nature and natural, very important in understanding Romans chapter 1. The Romans were new rulers, and they were sending people to Rome as slaves. And the letter to the Romans was very important, in my opinion, because it provided the slaves and the lower class protection from the rulers. The letter reinforced the laws that forbid the mistress or the master from engaging in reprehensible acts with the servants or the slaves. And while reading this text, I asked myself, is Paul rebuking the church leaders for their conduct towards the common people? And what do I mean by that? Having sex with a child, having sex with a slave, having sex with anyone without their consent would be unnatural, and it would be an abomination. So in Romans 1:24 and 25th chapters, God is giving people up to uncleanliness, but it's very important to remember that there were slaves involved, slaves that were followers of Christ. And Paul's letter to the Romans, in my opinion, seems to provide protection for the lower classes from church leaders and from the master, from the governing power, from sexual abuse. It's informing the people who were ignorant, and the Romans were ignorant of the culture of the native people. They had no respect for it. And this letter is telling them how they're supposed to conduct themselves. The movie Fellini, Satyricon, provides details of why this letter may have been necessary. But this letter to the Romans had nothing to do with consensual same-sex relationships or same-sex marriages. Instead, it had everything to do with human rights and consent. My next and last upload regarding this topic will define effeminate. Thank you for listening.